Hello and welcome, I'm DDF Racer, and in this video I'm going to run you through my wheel settings for RaceRoom Racing Experience. Now, a few of you have been asking recently how I've got my force feedback and my steering configured, so I thought I'd throw a little something together. Now, first and foremost, I'm using a Logitech G29 wheel and pedal set with a shifter left over from my previous G27 wheel, because the G29 doesn't come with the shifter for some reason. It's not the most expensive wheel out there by any means, but it is a good entry-level piece of gear and a great choice for any sim racer who's just getting started, or maybe a more experienced sim racer such as myself who doesn't have a lot of money. Having a force feedback steering wheel such as this is absolutely essential if you want to get the most enjoyment possible out of sim racing. Sure, you can use a keyboard or a gamepad if you like, but you'll never be able to feel what the car is doing. As a sim racer, you don't have the G-forces you'd experience in a real car to tell you how close to the limit of grip you are. All you have to rely on are the visual cues of the car's rotation on screen, the audio cues from the tyres squealing, and the physical cues from the force feedback in the wheel, which is why it is so important to have it set up properly. Quick disclaimer, by the way, I am no kind of physics expert or developer guru. These settings I'm using are just the results of lots of testing and trial and error, and although they might feel pretty good to me, your tastes will probably be different. I only intend on these settings being a starting point, so if you want to go ahead and make some tweaks that suit you better, then go for it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments and what works for you as well. The first thing you want to do is open up the Logitech Profiler. This piece of software controls the master settings on your Logitech G29 wheel, and it is important to get these right, otherwise you won't be working from a standard point, and any changes you make in RaceRoom further down the line may not be relevant. So the first thing you want to do is click on this button here, which is going to scan for your games. Now, it's important to do this because the Logitech Profiler software can actually have different wheel settings depending on what game you're using, so you want to make sure that RaceRoom is set up. So you can see I've already got RaceRoom installed here, got that selected, click on OK, and across the top of the screen you can see the RaceRoom icon, so make sure you click on that to select the active profile. Okay, so next you want to go down to the bottom of the screen and click on the settings icon here. Click G29 along the top and make sure that allow game to adjust force settings is enabled. Click on OK and head back to your steering wheel options. Now you can see when you highlight steering wheel at the top here, there is a tiny drop down box that appears. Now it's very easy to miss this, but make sure you click on this and click on Axis Properties. This brings up the steering wheel settings. Now in here you want to make sure that sensitivity is set to 50% to ensure a linear amount of rotation in the game. Basically what that means is, say if you move the wheel 90 degrees, it actually translates to 90 degrees in RaceRoom as well. Changing the sensitivity will cause your physical input not to match the input you're sending to the game, and it's just not going to feel natural. Next, make sure that your wheel operating range is set to 900 degrees. This is the maximum working range of the Logitech G29, and although it might sound like a lot, you won't actually be using 900 degrees most of the time. Each car in RaceRoom has its own individual degrees of rotation and is automatically set from within the game itself, so if the real car only has 420 degrees of rotation in the wheel, then this is all you're going to be able to physically turn it in the game. By setting degrees of rotation to 900 in the Profiler ensures that, again, you always get the correct 1-to-1 input ratio. Finally, make sure you disable the centering spring force feedback option and set the percentage to 0. You don't need these effects, and it'll only interfere with RaceRoom. Speaking of which, let's go and take a look at RaceRoom. If this is the first time you're using your wheel with RaceRoom, then you'll need to go to the options at the top here and select on control settings and then controller profiles, making sure you select the default Logitech G29 profile. This should automatically map all of the usual controls to your wheel, such as the shift up, shift down, but you can also customize your other assignments like DRS, brake bias, and pit limiter using the Edit Assignments menu on the left-hand side of the screen. To make sure everything is working right and your wheel has been configured correctly, go to the Advanced Settings page, and you can see on the top right here your inputs. So just give the throttle a little kick, there we go, give the clutch a kick, give the brakes some love, give us some steering, and you can see, yep, everything works. All the inputs are registering. Now all of the options below should really be left at default. Just because they're there doesn't mean you have to go changing them. Sector 3 created the default Logitech G29 profile to work out of the box, and as far as the screen goes, it's already set up and good to go. When you scroll down, you can see sensitivity and dead zone settings. Now, sensitivity, again, make sure you keep this at 50% to ensure linear inputs. And if there's one thing you want to play around with here, maybe it's the dead zones. Completely your personal preference here, although I leave them at 0 and 100% respectively. You might want to dial in some dead zone if, say, your throttle pedal is dragging or your brake pedal is dragging a little bit and there's a persistent input even when you're not pressing it. You really don't want any steering dead zone though, because that just means that you lose that fine control around the center point of the wheel. And now we move on to the part of the video that you are probably watching this for, the force feedback menu. Click on this bit here and here are your options. The force feedback options in RaceRoom are split up into 3 distinct sections. You've got your general force feedback settings here, which are kind of your master settings, so to speak. Then you've got your steering force settings, which are your physics-based settings. And last at the bottom, you've got force feedback effect settings. These are added effects such as curb vibrations and impacts, just to add a little bit more flavor to the feedback. Probably the most important setting is the force feedback toggle. Now, I think it goes without saying, you need to make sure this is turned on. Otherwise, you won't be getting any force feedback effects. Next on the list, you have inverted force feedback. Now, this is purely a configuration thing and not something you should be playing around with if you don't have to. It's set to on by default for me, but if it's wrong, you'll immediately be able to tell as you head out on track, and as you steer, the force feedback will pull you towards the corner. Now, the whole point of force feedback is to give you resistance when you're going around the track and tell you about the feeling of the car. And if you're turning into a high-speed corner, the car is going to want to resist that and push back. So you're going to have to pull the car towards the corner. If you feel like you're having to push the car away from the corner as you turn in, you need to invert your force feedback because that's coming the wrong way around. Now, we're not using a gamepad here, we're using a steering wheel, so make sure that gamepad rumble is turned off. And another pretty self-explanatory option is the force feedback intensity. This sets the master strength of the feedback you're going to be experiencing in-game. Now, I like to run somewhere between 50 and 70 depending on the car. You can actually change this from the menu in the pits for when you actually start the session, but yeah, you're going to want to keep an eye on your clipping meter when you're actually in-game. I'll put some footage of that on the screen now, but you want to see that basically you're not going over the red line too much. You can go over a little bit. Sector 3 does say that some clipping is allowed, but if you're getting flat lines at the top of your clipping meter, then you're going to want to turn this down a bit. Smoothing. Use this at your peril. I have it set to 0 because I want to feel all of the details in the track, but if your wheel is rattling a bit too much, if you're getting a few Manitou vibrations, if you just want to have less bitty movements in the force feedback, then turn the smoothing up, but I personally wouldn't recommend it. And these two settings at the bottom, force feedback spring and force feedback damper, I would leave these set at 0 because these are essentially the same as the centering spring that you found in the Logitech Profiler. They only really dull down the rest of the force feedback you're going to be experiencing in RaceRoom, so you might as well leave them at 0 and let the physics engine take care of the rest. Moving on to the next section, the steering force settings. This is what the game engine and the physics engine directly controls, so this is where all of the magic happens. Steering force intensity is another master control. However, this only affects the steering forces and not things like curbs or impacts. You'd only want to use this master setting if you want to turn down just the steering forces that you get in the force feedback. Force feedback minimum force. Now this is an interesting one because basically it brings up the lowest level of feedback to a higher level so you can feel the finer details. The problem you've got is the Logitech G29 doesn't have an amazing amount of power in the motor, so there is a very limited range of the forces you can feel. So if you turn this up too much, then you're going to start to feel very washed out force feedback, and you're not going to feel much of a difference between, say, the subtle forces of going over a bump in the track and smashing into the barrier at 200 kilometers an hour. In my experience, having it at around 5 to 10%, I usually go at 5, just brings out the bumps and the smaller details a little bit more, but doesn't really wash it out too much. Moving on to the understeer value, this is basically, it affects how much warning you get when the front tyres start to lose grip and the wheel goes light. A higher percentage means that it drops off more quickly and it can feel like the car goes from having lots of grip to absolutely no grip whatsoever. Whereas a low percentage, the steering wheel is going to stay loaded up no matter how much grip you lose. So it's always best to go in the middle around about here, but tailor this to your personal preference. I like 60 because it kind of gives me that edge of grip, you know, I can tell when I'm being a little bit too cheeky with the front tyres. The vertical load setting is probably one of the most important settings in this option. It allows you to feel the weight transfer over hills and going through crests, basically when the car goes light and when it grips up due to elevation changes. For example, when you're going through the bottom of Eau Rouge at Spa, the wheel is going to feel so much heavier when you have the vertical load turned up, but that is exactly how it should feel. And it sounds quite obvious, but this really helps the car feel alive and is incredibly useful for judging how much grip you've got. I have this turned all the way up to 100. And the lateral load is pretty much the same as vertical load, except instead of up and down forces, this is left and right forces. So this is when you're going through corners, it basically tells you how much grip you have in the tyres and affects how much force feedback you get from turning through corners, which is the whole point of it really, I guess. This setting is going to give you so much information as to how the car is behaving and how much you can push, basically. So you're going to want to have this setting pretty high as well. Now, I tend to mix it between 90 and 100. I mean, I'm at 90 at the moment, but to be honest, it doesn't make too much of a difference, but you are going to want to run it very high. Now, the steering rack setting is... I'm still not sure about this one, to be honest with you. I've played around with this quite a bit, and I can't really make my mind up, so maybe someone could help me clear this one up in the comments, but basically this determines the ratio of feedback you get from the tyres versus the ratio of feedback you get from the steering rack, with 0 being all tyres and 100 being all steering rack. From my experience, adding in more steering rack only makes the car feel lighter and just adds more vibrations into the wheel as well, so I do like a little bit of a blend of this one, but I tend to run it more towards tyres because you have, in my opinion, you have a bit more of a feeling of what the car is actually doing. So as you can see on the screen here, yep, I like to run this around about 20%, but anything around the 10 to 30 is good. But like I said, let me know in the comments, guys, what you run at and how this affects your driving. Moving on to the force feedback effect settings. Now, for want of a better word, these are canned effects. These sliders in the bottom section aren't directly affected by the physics as far as I can tell, but are instead sensations that are triggered through the wheel by certain specific events such as gear changes and impacts and so on. Now, some of you may just throw your arms up in the air in disgust and argue that this isn't real force feedback, it's just pre-programmed, to which I say, true. However, what these effects do rather nicely is add some extra flavour to the feedback. Used sparingly, these can really boost the immersion that you experience in the game. The first one on the list is the slip effect, and you would be amazed at how much of an impact this one single setting has on the overall feel of the force feedback. It just progressively adds in vibration whenever the tyres load up, which is like every single time you turn the steering wheel at speed. Now on a belt wheel or a direct drive wheel, I can imagine this might feel quite nice, but on a Logitech G29, it is absolutely horrible and only ends up rattling the hell out your steering wheel and vibrating so much that your downstairs neighbours file a noise complaint. Honestly, I've had this setting turned up for a long time before I realised how much of an effect it had, to the point where I was turning down my overall force feedback level because it was rattling like crazy and I thought it was clipping out. Wrong! As soon as I dropped the slip effect, the whole thing felt so much better and I could bump up the overall force feedback strength again with no problems whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't use this at all, a little bit is nice, but 10% is probably the absolute maximum you'd want to go on a Logitech G29 in my opinion, unless you enjoy the feeling of rattling through your arms and making everybody within a 5km radius extremely cranky due to the noise. Next on the list are engine vibrations. Now, this basically adds in some vibrations depending on the revs you're experiencing or maybe a potential engine damage situation. So it's not that noticeable. I mean, I have it down at 25%, but turn it up and have a go. It basically just affects how much the engine vibrates through the steering wheel. And the curb vibration setting, well, that pretty much explains itself. That is the strength of the feedback you will get when you run over the curbs. Now, I like the feeling of curbs because curbs generally tend to tell you the edge of the track limit, so you're going to want to feel that basically. It's giving you a warning that you're going too far. I run it at around about 50% here. And the shift effect adds in basically a slight kick to the steering wheel when you change gears, which is especially nice in cars that don't have a seamless shift gearbox, although the effect is a little bit lost when you're running a H-pattern gearbox. And last but certainly not least, because I'm sure that many of you are going to experience this effect just like myself, is the collision effect. And that basically controls the strength of the effects when you hit the barrier or another competitor. I always run this at maximum, and you can actually push this all the way up to 200% because, well, a crash is a crash, and I want to feel that. Running a G29, it's gonna be fine because it doesn't have the motor strength of a direct drive wheel, and you are never gonna rip the wheel out of your hands and snap your wrists. You are very safe turning this one all the way up to maximum. And that's pretty much it. That's how I've got my wheel set up in RaceRoom. Like I said earlier in the video though, this is just what feels good to me, so give it a go, but don't take my word for it as the absolute truth, you know, because, DDF Racer told me to do this, but it feels terrible. Nah. If you find some tweaks to suit you better, then go for it and let me know in the comments. At the end of the day, it is all about you getting the most out of the sim. Tuning the force feedback is something of an art form, and we all have different tastes, but the aim of this video is to give you at least a good starting point to work from. Anyway, whether you are completely new to RaceRoom and getting your Logitech wheel setup for the first time, or you're a seasoned veteran looking to come back and get some extra tips, I hope you found something useful. If so, leave the video a like, and make sure you subscribe to see all of these settings in action in my future races and live streams. Thank you so much for watching. I've been DDF Racer, and I'll see you all next time.